Hey all you cats and kittens and all you non-binary fittins, it's your boy DBiddles. Welcome to ChatBots. I'm sure by now you know how this goes. DBiddles builds anime robots. DBiddles talks about robot anime. DBiddles just keeps talking and talking and talking and talking. Hopefully at some point in time the stuff he's talking about starts to make sense to somebody other than him. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, yada yada yada. You know, part of the reason I started this channel was to have the kinds of conversations about robot anime that I just wasn't seeing on YouTube. Being a dork who hyperfixates on shit to find deeper understandings behind the stuff I like, I love video essays and video reviews. And while there's no shortage of aspiring AniTubers out there, most of them spend their time talking about the same stuff. They're either talking about whatever's the latest hottest thing, or they're talking about one of those handful of classic titles that everybody's heard of and already watched, or they're giving kind of shallow consumer reviews about throwaway titles that they watched once, made a video for, and then they never really thought about again, and rarely did that ever have much to say on the topic of robots. Sure, some folks do talk about robots, but I feel like, at least on the English-speaking parts of YouTube, it's rarely anything terribly substantial. Usually it's just stuff like, "This was a robot that existed," or "This robot's so cool, look at these lasers that it shoots, pew pew pew," or "This robot's got a big laser and it can totally blow up this other robot with an inferior laser, don't you know?" You sometimes get the sense that these are toy aficionados who like toys, and like the robot shows because they showcase the robots as toys, and not because there's something more intellectually enriching beyond being a cool toy. And while that's all lovely-dovely, heaven knows I love me a good toy, I kind of feel like we're missing the forest for the trees a little bit, or the machine for the nuts and bolts that make it up, if you will. I feel like there's a lot more to this than just cool robots what's got big lasers. I think the fact that these robots exist and why their stories play out the way they do kind of has some interesting stuff to say about broader society, particularly in the Japanese context. The robots is art, after all, and not just in the sense that they're pretty pictures or pretty sculptures or pretty animation, but in the sense that their stories have messages that they're trying to convey, lessons that they're trying to teach. All artists just want to be understood through their art. They want their art to tell the audience things in a way that helps the audience care about and agree with what the artist is saying and appreciate their point of view. And hopefully my videos have kind of done that too in making you understand why I think the robots are cool and also why I think other things too. But most of the time in my videos, I'm using the robots to illustrate some separate point rather than focusing on the robot themselves. You could say I'm politicizing them if you're the type of mouth-breathing soup brain to take every contrary interpretation of art as some sort of personal attack on your worldview because, I don't know, maybe you recognize that your worldview is deeply flawed and that people who make cool art think so too. But rather than re-examine your prior convictions, you'd rather just shout down anyone who attempts to highlight the parts of art that showcase any point being made that is headier than a toy commercial. Sorry, lost my train of thought there for a moment. Choo-choo, all aboard! So this time, I kinda want to do the opposite of my normal routine. Rather than use the robot to illustrate some point about the world, I want to examine the stuff from the world that went into making the robots. All of culture is a stew, a product of its surroundings, a reflection of the world that it was born into, a combination of context and influence and inspiration. So with that in mind, how's come piloted robots became a thing in the first place? Where come did this phenomenon start, and why come is it a whole genre rather than just a one-off thing? What part of the Japanese psyche was the robot subconsciously or even textually speaking to? What can we learn about Japan from the robot, and what influence did it have on broader Japanese pop culture beyond just the trend of robots being a thing? And what does DBiddles like about them so much, if not just the nifty toys? How does any of this pertain to present day? What are some broader lessons we might learn from this discussion? And why is it that birds can fly, but flies can't bird? Well, hopefully by the end of this episode and next, we might have some answers to those. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. I haven't even introduced this fellow yet. This here is Mazinger Z. And while he's not the first of the robots, he's kind of who gets the most credit for really making this robot genre a thing. And yes, I know it's spelled Mazinger Z, but outside of America, the letter Z gets pronounced Z by just about every other English-speaking country, and the theme song in the Japanese audio refers to him as Mazinger Z. So Z is what I'm going with. Cope and see, the Americucks. Also, I feel it's worth mentioning, if you didn't already know, that while I'm going to be examining Mazzy here and the historical and cultural phenomenon around what made him happen, I'm not actually Japanese. I've never been to Japan, I've never formally studied Japan in an academic setting. I'm not that smart. I'm just kind of telling you what little I know, making some observations, and kind of just dissecting it and comparing it to other works, all based on my limited outsider perspective. So if I leave some information out, or I miss my mark, or say something incorrect, feel free to shout it out in the comments and maybe include a nasty personal insult to really drive the point home. Maybe if your insult really stings, or if I get corrected enough, I'll do a follow-up video reading your comments and usernames out loud whilst sobbing pathetically. Anyways, Mazinger. In October of 1972, mangaka Go Nagai published the first manga chapters of Mazinger Z via Shueisha's weekly Shonen Jump magazine. Yes, the very same Shonen Jump magazine. 1972 was a very big year for Nagai-san, as not only would that September mark the end of his breakout manga hit Harenshi Gakuen, which translates to Scandal School or Shameless School, but he would also begin his manga Devilman in June of that year. And both Devilman and Mazinger would be adapted to anime via Toei Animation and would premiere on TV Asahi in July and Fuji TV in December, respectively. The impact of these three works alone on Japanese pop culture cannot be overstated, but Nagai would also go on to pen other hugely influential works which include, but are not limited to, Cutie Honey, Violence Jack, Dororon Enmakun, Kekko Kamen, Kotetsu Jig, Oira Sukaban, Shuten Doji, Jushin Liger, the Abashiri family, two sequels to Mazinger known as Great Mazinger and UFO Robo Grendizer, and he would collaborate with Ken Ishikawa on the creation of Getter Robo, yet another hugely influential work. So yeah, your man here has a pretty stacked resume. Mazinger Z, the manga, would last for 5 volumes and the anime would run for 92 episodes, both ending in September 1974 and leading into Great Mazinger almost immediately after. Great Mazinger would run for 56 anime episodes and 2 manga volumes, lasting until 1975, whereupon UFO Robo Grendizer would pick up for 74 episodes and 1 manga volume, with the anime ending in 1977. Mazinger Z follows Koji Kabuto, the grandson of the brilliant Professor Juzo Kabuto and the older brother of Shiro Kabuto. Koji and Shiro live with their grandfather until the day that a bomb detonates in the professor's underground laboratory, prompting Koji to investigate. Koji discovers his dying grandfather laying in the shadow of a giant robot that the professor explains he has built in order to battle a great coming evil. A few months prior, Juzo had been part of an archaeological team investigating some pre-Grecian ruins on the fictional Bardos Island, which once belonged to the Mycenae Empire. You know how it is, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, scientists didn't have any kind of specialized field of study, they just knew everything about everything, so obviously Professor Juzo is both an expert on robotics and ancient civilizations. Anyways, the archaeological team discovers an army of remote-controlled giant steel monsters which come to be known as the Kikaiju, or mechanical beasts. One of Juzo's colleagues on the team, Dr. Hell, decides that this is the opportunity he's been looking for to finally break into the field of supervillainy, what with his name being Dr. Hell and all. And he kills the other members of the team, with Professor Kabuto barely managing to escape with his life. Professor managed to finish his own robot before Dr. Hell's assassin showed up, but now with his life fading, the duty of piloting the mech and battling the Kikaiju now falls to Koji. Though the professor warns that with great power comes that with this machine he can be like unto a god, or a devil. Koji swears revenge, climbs into the hoverpilder, locks into Mazinger's head, and ascends to the surface to begin battling some of the Kikaiju which are attacking Tokyo. There he encounters Sayaka Yumi piloting a female robot named Aphrodite A, also doing battle with the Kikaiju. It seems, upon returning to Japan all those months ago, Professor Juzo informed his apprentice, Dr. Genosuke Yumi, head of the Photon Power Institute, of Dr. Hell's plans. So Dr. Yumi constructed Aphrodite using the blueprints of Mazinger as an influence, and he tasked his daughter with piloting it. Awful obliging of Dr. Hell to wait for both robots to be built before launching his world conquest campaign. Between that and him only sending 1 or 2 Kikaiju into battle at a time, one has to question his competence. Perhaps he's a doctor in the same way Mehmet Oz or Phil McGraw are doctors, technically so, but mostly just strong personalities who leverage their influence to make themselves seem smarter than they actually are. You know, if he had a daytime television talk show, I bet my mother would watch it. Anyways, Sayaka's had more time to practice piloting, so she's initially the more competent force. But Mazinger proves to have superior durability and firepower, so despite Koji having only been sitting in the cockpit for an afternoon, and having been concussed in his first battle from not wearing a helmet inside the cockpit, they managed to repel the Kikaiju for the time being. Mazinger joins forces with the Photon Institute, and so Koji, Sayaka, and Dr. Yumi, along with Shiro, Koji's school chums Boss, Nuke, and Mucha, and Professors Sawashi, Nosori, and Morimori, pledged themselves to the defeat of Dr. Hell and his mutilated minions, who include the bisected hermaphroditic Baron Ashura, the decapitated Waffen-SS officer Count Brocken, the stereotypical voodoo witch doctor atop a stereotypical tribal warrior Viscount Pigman, and an army of semi-robotic Iron Mask and Iron Cross stormtroopers. Every episode, Dr. Hell sends 1 or 2 Kikaiju out to wreak havoc with their unique destructive abilities, and every episode, Mazinger Z, Aphrodite A, and the comedic relief Boss Bo-Rot thwart said Kikaiju, usually with one of Mazinger's signature weapons. Eventually, Dr. Hell is defeated by the end of the 92 episodes, but in his absence rises the Mycenae Empire's own Ankoku Daishogun, or the Great General of Darkness, along with his army of far stronger warrior beasts. See, while the Kikaiju were just machines, the Sento Jewel, or warrior beasts, are partially organic and have the brains of Mycenaean warriors transplanted into them, so they're more cunning in addition to being more powerful. In 1974's film Mazinger Z Tai Ankoku Daishogun, Archduke Gorgon brings the Great General to the surface, and the handful of warrior beasts that accompany him absolutely decimate our hero. All seems lost for Mazinger until the surprise arrival of Great Mazinger, who is powerful enough to dispatch with the warrior beast and rescue Koji. Great Mazinger, as it turns out, was built by Kenzo Kabuto, who is the late Professor Juzo's son and Koji and Shiro's dad, and Great Mazinger was designed to be Mazinger's superior. It's piloted by Tetsuya Tsurugi, who is both older than Koji and apparently has been raised by Kenzo. Wow, Kenzo sucks. And people give Goku shit for being a bad anime father. At least he wasn't off raising some other kid while he was busy neglecting Gohan and Goten. And apparently he had this way cooler robot just ready to go, and he didn't bother to bust it out or tell anybody until Koji and Shiro almost died. Gee, thanks, Dad. Now we know where Anno got the idea for Gendo Ikari. So from there, Great Mazinger took over the airways, and Tetsuya is of course accompanied by his own lady sidekick, the half-black, half-Japanese Jun Hono, piloting Venus Ace. And also, Boss Bo-Rot is back because he proved to be a popular enough character in the first series. And so, for 56 episodes, they battled the 7 armies of warrior beasts with great special attacks, which include upgraded versions of all of Mazinger's specials, but also a handful of new ones. Partway through the series, the Great General of Darkness is defeated and replaced by the Great Marshal of Hell, who turns out to be, surprise surprise, the not actually dead Dr. Hell. And then after all that, Koji shows up to make friends with Duke Freed, who pilots Grendizer against alien monsters from the planet Vega, and blah blah blah, you get it. Grendizer will get his own video later on, probably covering the anime reboot that's coming out this year, 2024, which just so happens to be the 50th anniversary of Grendizer. Anyways, it all seems pretty rote and standard now, but obviously at time of original airing, it was a pretty exciting ordeal, and Mazinger saw immense popularity that made him an enduring cultural icon into this day, even despite being canonically surpassed in power by Great Mazinger and Grendizer, and even despite inspiring 50 years of giant robot progress both following and deviating from this model. So, what made this formula blow up like it did when it did? Well, speaking of blowing up, World War II! December 7th, 1941 saw the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service launch a surprise attack on the U.S.-American naval base Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, killing close to 2,400 servicemen and injuring about 1,200 more. With this, America formally joined the Allied forces in the global war effort, with special interest in the Pacific theater. Obviously, there were geographical reasons for this focus, but also not a small amount of vindictive political reasonings too. America suffered 1.25 million casualties in the war, with 1 million of those being inflicted within the last 365 days of the war. 1939 saw Germany starting the development of nuclear weapons technology in the wake of the discovery of nuclear fission in Berlin just months prior. However, between numerous starts and stops due to the war effort, and with much of Germany's academia having fled the Nazi regime in the years prior, progress was slow. Late August 1939, Albert Einstein sent a letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt warning him of the German nuclear weapons program and advising the Allies to consider their own similar studies to counter the Axis, which did eventually manifest in August 1942 as the Manhattan Project. By late December 1944, FDR advised his top military brass that if the Manhattan Project's atomic bombs were ready, they should be prepared to drop them on Germany to prevent heavy casualties. But with the project's timeline, it seemed likely that the European front would collapse before then. An ongoing firebombing campaign of the Japanese mainland carried out by Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers had begun in November 1944, which proved largely ineffective due to a number of factors. Hard to imagine that Boeing used to have to try really hard to get people killed. However, the targeting of metropolitan areas starting in January 1945 and carrying on for several months after proved to be more brutally successful. The Japanese civil defenses were ineffective at combating the high-altitude planes, and eventually, they stopped scrambling fighter planes to intercept the B-29s altogether, preferring to hold on to their aircraft for an expected invasion force. Leaflets were also dropped from the B-29s warning of air raids and listing planned targeted cities. Despite the demoralized state of much of the Japanese citizenry and the struggles of their military, the Japanese government and Emperor Hirohito were committed to the war effort and ordered the arrest of anyone caught holding one of these leaflets. February 1945, Prince Fumimaro Konoe told Hirohito that he suspected Japanese defeat was inevitable and advised surrender. Late April 1945, a committee was established by the U.S. government to determine where in Japan the atom bombs would be dropped. On June 1, 1945, the Manhattan Project's Interim Committee concluded that, quote, "The bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible, that it be used on a war plant surrounded by workers' homes, and that it be used without prior warning." No mention of the atomic bombs was ever listed in the leaflets dropped by the B-29s, and Hiroshima was not one of the listed targets on said leaflets. July 26 saw the issue of the Potsdam Declaration, proposing the ultimatum of unconditional surrender, or the, quote, "inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces, and just as inevitably the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland." Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki rejected this. Publicly, the Japanese War Cabinet was committed to Japan's extinction before surrender. The Japanese government's strong national pride, coupled with its numerous military victories leading up to World War II, had them unwilling to concede defeat. However, privately, Hirohito had been convinced of the futility of the war on both the American and Chinese fronts since June, stating, "I was told that the iron from bomb fragments dropped by the enemy was being used to make shovels. This confirmed my opinion that we were no longer in a position to continue the war." On June 22nd, he spoke with his war cabinet about ending the war, but their appeals to the Soviet Union for aid against America fell on deaf ears, and they were unable to agree on favorable conditions for surrender that the U.S. would agree to. The condition they were most desperate for was preserving their positions in government. August 6, 1945. With the consent of the United Kingdom, the Enola Gay dropped the Little Boy bomb on the industrial city of Hiroshima. On the 7th, President Harry S. Truman once again urged Japan to surrender. On the 9th, the Enola Gay took to the air for a second time and dropped the far more powerful Fat Man bomb on the far less modernized city of Nagasaki. Between immediate deaths and deaths from radiation sickness or other traumas, It's estimated that up to 230,000 people were killed, most of whom were non-combatants. President Truman was informed that a third bomb would not be ready until the 19th, and a fourth not until September. These attacks, coupled with the Soviet invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria, was enough to prompt serious debate amongst the Japanese war cabinet about the conditions of surrender, though their votes on what to do were deadlocked, and Minister of War Korichika Anami was convinced that an all-out battle with American ground forces on the Japanese mainland would play out favorably for Japan, and he was a fierce advocate of the death before dishonor mindset. On the 14th, President Truman said to his British ambassador that, "Sadly, he now had no alternative but to order an atomic bomb dropped on Tokyo." That same day, Suzuki and the Emperor recognized that either they would sign the surrender or they would endure a military coup from their own forces. Anami's party loyalists called for said coup, but Anami deferred to the Emperor when Hirohito called for surrender, and Anami committed seppuku on the 15th after he and the rest of the military officials signed the surrender.
Excuse me, what's all this have to do with Mazinger, DBiddles?
Ugh, I'm getting to it, viewer. Jesus. So impatient. Now, to say that this defeat was a blow to Japanese nationalist pride would be an understatement. Japan had been doing quite well for itself up until this point. It had been victorious in the Russo-Japanese War and the First Sino-Japanese War, had conquered Korea and Manchuria, and had joined the Allies in World War I, earning it a few more prizes when Germany was defeated and made responsible for the war debt for that conflict. See, Japan is an island nation, and as such, had been primarily isolationist for centuries. But the 1850s saw the Meiji Restoration period, wherein American Commodore Matthew Perry had visited Japan with the aim of opening up trade with the region. Where prior Japan had occupied itself with feudalism and shogunates and samurai and various forms of infighting for control of the countryside, the Restoration period unified the nation under Emperor Meiji. And with sudden influence from outside powers bringing new ideas, new technologies, and new goods to Japan for the first time in a long time, Japan rather heartily took to the notion of imperialism as a means of enriching itself. After all, these foreigners have brought some neat stuff to their doorstep, but there's a whole big world of cool foreign stuff out there to play with, not all of which is being delivered, and who knows, maybe they're keeping all the best stuff to themselves. If they don't want to share it, maybe Japan ought to take it from them? Is that crazy? It sounds crazy, but I kind of like the idea, you know? While Japan was technically a democracy during this era, an emperor is still kind of like a monarch. They're an unelected official, they're immune from prosecution, they're head of the Shinto religion, said to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and they're head of state, so you do the math. And since going out into the world to nick everyone's cool stuff was what they were committed to doing, the military definitely had a lot more sway over the direction of policy than you might want in a nation. Which is jolly good fun so long as you're the one winning, but when you start losing, maybe it stops being so much fun. And while Japan was now a unified nation, not everyone was unified in wanting to leave home to go smash shit up on the other side of creation just for the sake of raping and pillaging. Plenty of people rather didn't like raping and pillaging, thank you very much. They had plenty of domestic issues that had gone unaddressed for a very long time, and would continue going unaddressed now that the government had its new hobby. Despite what you might have heard about cultural hegemony and what you might think about previously warring states now united under a central government, the Japanese people are not a monolith. There are lots of progressives, lots of leftists, lots of anti-authoritarians, lots of queer folks, and believe it or not, even ethnic minorities such as the indigenous Ainu folk. Though this new authoritarian regime of the Yamato or Wajin ethnicity started the long and often cruel project of erasing and assimilating the Ainu culture. So, yeah, pretty mixed bag the Meiji era was, but overall a pretty economically prosperous one. Like I said, it's all shits and giggles so long as you're the one getting to kick everyone's asses, but if you bite off more than you can chew and get your own ass kicked hard enough for it, you start to re-examine things a bit. Getting all your towns firebombed to smithereens, losing a bunch of your neat toys like all your new colonies, getting absolutely decimated by the enemy's super secret new bomb that only they had and no one else had, having to watch thousands of your countrymen suffer and die from radiation sickness, tens of thousands of them return in disgrace from some senseless war, and hundreds of thousands of them displaced by that war and sifting through the wreckage of their former homes, and then having your ruined home occupied by your enemy to oversee your disarmament, well, let's just say it's little wonder Anami committed seppuku, even if he was a hyper-nationalist nutcase. The atom bomb in particular was the stuff of nightmares for the Japanese people going forward, and rightfully so. It's a pretty grisly invention, make no mistake. Getting dragged along for a long, bloody war that a lot of people didn't want, by heads of state that were allowed by the US government to remain in power after the war, by the way, and witnessing firsthand the devastating power of, to date, the most powerful weapon known to mankind, a lot of people were having some pretty serious thoughts about what to do next, many of whom had already been thinking these things in the lead-up to August 1945. This self-reflection manifested in a number of ways. Obviously, the country collectively rolled up its sleeves and set to work rebuilding. There's that indomitable human spirit for you. But obviously, some reassessment was in order. Some of them, regrettably, took to hyper-conservative isolationism. The world beyond Nippon's shores was capable of such savagery. Even if some of them had agreed with the Nazi regime, they couldn't trust the Ratsies to have their back, particularly as their party was being dismantled, and the Allies were obviously not being super friendly. So those such folks embraced a bitter xenophobic nationalism, made all the easier by Japan's status as an island nation. And since so much of this started with Commodore Perry's arrival on their shores, clearly not just his people, but the influence they brought in the form of culture and technology should be rejected too, so that a rigid Japanese traditionalism could be upheld. Modern convenience and industry must be rejected. And maybe, if American occupation wasn't a factor, this movement might have been embraced more readily. But the fact is, American GIs were pretty firmly stationed in Japan, and those Americans liked their culture, thank you very much. So long as they stayed, American goods would see a steady influx. And not everyone shared these shitty isolationist sentiments. Some people had far more constructive takeaways from this destruction. Obviously, the American occupation was a great opportunity for business, both in importing and exporting. And here the Zaibatsus, or the corporations, rubbed their hands, and us weebs of today are among the beneficiaries of these efforts. But still others came away deeply reconsidering a lot of the old ways. Modern conveniences were merely tools, and tools are only as good or as evil as the one who uses them. Even the atom bomb was merely a mishandling of the amazing discovery of nuclear energy. And maybe this constant conflict against one's fellow man, be they Japanese or otherwise, was just needless strife and suffering. The West had come offering trade initially, and Japan had foolishly then went in pursuit of conquest. And they had only gotten into this stupid war and carried on with it long past the point where defeat was inevitable because their leaders had wanted it, and doing so was mostly to the benefit of said leaders. Even though those leaders had been responsible for this war, it wasn't them who suffered the horrors of said war. Fuck, they didn't even lose their fucking jobs afterwards. Despite all the old folks claiming that the emperor was the descendant of divinity, surely such a divine countenance would not be so stupid as to keep picking dumb fights for dubious rewards, or at least have the good common sense to know how to avoid taking a second weapon of mass destruction up His Majesty's imperial tailpipe. As a result, very strong left-wing, anti-authoritarian, and progressive movements would fester, though only so much meaningful policy change would result from these movements. Progress, as ever, is slow and stubborn. And while tensions between the Americans and the Japanese were high, despite what your West Virginian uncle will tell you, few things can dispel racial animosity quite like living in diverse communities. Naturally, both parties would inevitably be intrigued by each other's way of life and the wondrous things the other's culture produced, and it's only natural that all of this would factor into the art that would come out of the coming decades. Artists, you see, tend to be pretty forward-thinking and lean pretty heavily left of center. Art so often speaks to humanity, and under inhuman status quos, as so many societies throughout history are quite flawed and imperfect, that means that art is so often somewhat subversive and critical of the status quos of the time.
Does this mean you're finally getting back to Mazinger, DBiddles?
Yes, viewer, I'm getting back to Mazinger. Fuck. Let's examine some of the pieces of Mazinger's story and compare them to some other contemporary works of the era to see what they can tell us about what Japanese artists were thinking and feeling in the wake of World War II, and how those sentiments manifest both in their art of then and today. So first things first, we have our threat, the Kikaiju, giant unstoppable mechanical monsters. Kaiju literally translates to strange beasts and has come to be the term associated with giant monsters, particularly the ones of Japanese origins. But thanks to Pacific Rim popularizing the term among normies, it's used by everyone for every extra-large dinosaur now. You know, when we're not calling them titans, God. The monster who started Japan's kaiju craze was obviously Godzilla, and if you've ever watched the original 1954 Gojira or the recent Godzilla -1, the metaphor of Godzilla is quite plainly an expression of the apprehensions over atomic devastation. Monsters in fiction are rarely just monsters. They're usually representations of some specific anxiety, and this is true of vampires, zombies, werewolves, creatures from the Black Lagoon, Michael Myerses, Cthulhu's, Slendermans, Pyramid Heads, Siren Heads, Pinheads, Freddy Fazbear's, you name it. Manifesting this horror as some huge, seemingly invincible, overwhelming, ancient, cold-blooded, primordial force of incomprehensible ruin. And a dinosaur, no less. One of the beasts that once ruled the earth before going extinct. Well, the metaphor seems pretty obvious. So much so that America actually did it the year prior with a film entitled The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, based on a Ray Bradbury story. But obviously that film didn't strike quite the same chord in America as Gojira did in Japan. The film ends with Godzilla's destruction at the hands of a powerful weapon called the Oxygen Destroyer, a device so fearsome that its creator, Dr. Serizawa, destroys all the blueprints for it and allows himself to be caught in the blast along with Godzilla, so that it might never again be utilized. But the characters speculate that another Godzilla might be spawned from continued nuclear weapons testing. The message of the film is clear. America and the world must never again countenance the use of atomic weaponry. Whatever you think of America's decision to use the atom bombs on Japan, and for the record, I think it was unquestionably the wrong decision, though obviously we'll never know for sure, it's impossible to deny that this was a profoundly terrifying act. Hundreds of thousands of lives effortlessly and instantaneously ended with a single strike. A strike that did not differentiate between soldiers, civilians, or American or Korean POWs. A strike that could not be anticipated or countered. It's existentially horrific, particularly since nuclear disarmament hasn't happened, and now multiple nations now hold these weapons. And the fear of this ultimate annihilation from ever-escalating warfare continues to manifest in anime from Space Runaway Ideon's Be Invoked, to Naruto's Tailed Beasts, to FMA's Philosopher's Stones, to Chainsaw Man's Gun Devil, to Gundam's Colony Drops, to Fist of the North Star and Vampire Hunter D and Violence Jack and Desert Punk's post-apocalyptic setting, to Dragon Ball's Frieza, to the events of Akira, Genocyber, Genma Tyson, Urotsuki Doji, Attack on Titan, even Go Nagai's own Devilman. Existence got just a little bit more fragile for the Japanese people, and that manifests in their art. Funnily enough, Godzilla proved popular enough to spawn a whole franchise of giant monsters in a shared cinematic universe, and the films pretty quickly shifted focus to a more child-friendly demographic, with Godzilla becoming something more of an anti-hero. Perhaps as a parallel to nuclear proliferation creating an international stalemate. Or perhaps the thinking is that your fears normalized become less terrifying, something that's pretty darkly satirized in the Fallout series that has recently gone mainstream with its Amazon Prime series. Thus did Godzilla give way to Anguirus and Mothra and Rodan and Gamera and Daimajin and Manda and Mogira and Gezora and Baragon and the rest. And it only took until his third appearance for the King of the Monsters to cross sword with America's own King Kong. These were among some of the earliest tokusatsu offerings. Tokusatsu, of course, means special effects, and it's a term that has come to mean any live-action Japanese film or television whose premise relies heavily on special effects and elaborate costume and prop design, be that science fiction, fantasy, horror, or superhero. And this is noteworthy because so much of the medium of anime and manga that would pop up in the aftermath would do so because of the pioneering mainstream success and marketability of those genres being proven to be worth investing in because of tokusatsu. Indeed, the kaiju craze was not limited to films, it spread to television too, with the likes of the Ultra series, spearheaded by Eiji Tsuburaya, the special effects director behind the original Godzilla films. 1966's Ultra Q featured a new monster every week being thwarted by human forces. But the second entry in the Ultra series would prove even more popular with the introduction of the giant Kyodai superhero Ultraman, who would assist Japan's science police in fending off the threats of kaiju. Kyodai heroes would become their own subgenre of tokusatsu, and thus did Ultraman give way to Red Baron, Ambassador Magma, Zone Fighter, Jumborg Ace, Spectraman, as well as a succession of other Ultramen, all who fought the good fight against the giant beasties. And not all kaiju were giants either. Some were roughly human-sized, such as the various monster men of the criminal organization Shocker, who in 1971 did battle with Shotaro Ishinomori's grasshopper-themed motorcycle-riding superhero, Kamen Rider. A mutant cyborg creation of Shocker who escaped before receiving his evil brainwashing treatment, Takeshi Hongo, and later Hayato Ichimonji, transforms or henshins into Kamen Rider to resist Shocker's plans for global conquest, even as it is revealed that Shocker has ties to the upper echelons of government and business. And with Kamen Rider's success, many more henshin heroes would follow, such as Inazuman, Space Sheriff Gavon, Lion Maru, and the various Super Sentai, aka Power Ranger teams, all featuring some sort of form change or metamorphosis into a truer, more powerful self that would empower them to fight back against kaiju. A henshin tradition that continues to this day with Super Saiyans, Sailor Scouts, Science Ninja teams, Bronze Saints, Digivolution, Berserker Armor, and Chainsaw Men, with these transformative states often being acquired after enduring some trial, trauma, or training. The kaiju boom rode off the popularity of these giant terrors, but the recurring theme of these series was resoundingly clear. Even the strangest of beasts can be fought and can be beaten. Many Japanese people at the time erroneously blamed Albert Einstein for the atomic bomb's creation, one Japanese magazine editor asking him, quote, "Why did you cooperate in the production of atomic bombs knowing full well their destructive power?" Now, obviously, us enlightened folks of the future know it was actually invented by Cillian Murphy, Benny Safdie, David Krumholtz, Gustav Skarsgård, and I think Margot Robbie and Ryan Gosling, if I'm remembering the plot of Barbenheimer correctly. But Einstein being such a popular public figure, it's a little piece of misinfo that stuck pretty well in everyone's mind. Kinda like how Yoko Ono still gets blamed for breaking up the Beatles. And that might be why Dr. Hell, the man responsible for unleashing the Kikaiju on the world, kind of resembles a cruel, twisted version of Einstein, though this motif of Einstein's wild hair has kind of carried itself over to a number of archetypical mad scientists throughout fiction. Certainly it's true of Mega Man's own Dr. Albert Wiley. Despite this, Einstein is notedly quite critical of the bomb's usage, and is quick to remind the interviewer in question that all he did was write a letter to President Roosevelt, and that had he known the Nazis would fail to develop nuclear weapons, he claims he never would have done even that. Oh yes, there's plenty of blame for the atrocities of World War II to go around, isn't there? Count Brocken being a former Nazi soldier, and the Iron Mask and Iron Cross soldiers being mindless uniformed fascist minions, demonstrate how it wasn't lost on the younger Japanese folks that, yeah, the Nazis were pretty bad, actually. And later representations of this, from Gundam's Principality of Zeon, to Hellsing's Millennium, to 86's Republic of San Magnolia, to FMA's Führer King Bradley, to Jinro the Wolf Brigade and the rest of the Kerberos saga, to Captain Harlock's Alien Mazone, to the somewhat confused themes of Attack on Titan, to Kamen Rider's own Shocker being made up of Nazi remnants, the message has been heard and the point reiterated. Nazis equals bad. And yes, that includes von Stroheim from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Now, of course, this coalition of villains is a little confused in its metaphors. Einstein was a Jewish German scientist who fled the Nazi regime, and the atomic bomb was originally intended to be used against the Nazis. And none of that really explains Ashura or Pigman. But I think it's kind of going for a larger-than-life representation of multiple evils. And I think it's no accident that they are channeling a power from Mycenaean Greece to achieve these aims. The Nazis famously utilized the mythologized past as a rallying cry for their hatred and a focal point for their supposed superiority. You were once masters of the world, but degenerates have stolen your birthright. Certainly the hearkening to Norse cultures of Viking warriors was part of it, but Hitler and the Nazis were quite notably fond of Greece as some kind of idyllic past society that had been stolen from them, particularly the culture of Sparta and their imagined history as the world's greatest warriors. See my Scope Dog video for more on that. The notion that everything was perfect in the good old Hyperborean days, but has since been stolen from you and the natural order subverted, and that the only way to return is through brutal authoritarian force, is the driving conceit of fascist ideology. The romanticization of ancient Greece and other hyper-idealized cultures of antiquity continues to this day. Something, how often does your man think about the Roman Empire? But it's important to remember that while Greece and Rome and Italy and Finland were and are really real places, just as the Mycenaean civilization was, some of the stuff from those times that these fascists rave about are exaggerated, unrealistic versions of the truth, such as how ideal these societies truly were, or the notion of an army of unstoppable militaristic forces. And standing against this evil is Mazinger Z. The atomic bomb didn't just inspire fear, but also awe. All science, all technological advancement is morally neutral, and it's only the application that determines whether or not it's for good or for ill. In 1956, mangaka Mitsutaro Yokoyama started his classic manga Tetsujin 28 Go, which translates to Iron Man 28. But when its 1963 anime was imported to the States in one of the earliest wave of anime localizations, its name was changed to Gigantor for copyright reasons. Tetsujin tells the story of young Shotaro Kaneda, a boy detective and orphan son to the late Dr. Kaneda. Dr. Kaneda was part of the Tetsujin project in the days of World War II, but it was mothballed before it could ever see use in the war, and so Dr. Kaneda left their 28th model, the titular giant robot, to his son. Whomsoever possesses Tetsujin's remote control device can dictate the actions of the metal behemoth, and naturally this means he can be a force for righteousness, fighting crime or aiding those in need, or it can be used for great harm if it should fall into the wrong hands. Tetsujin would serve as the inspiration for the American film The Iron Giant, wherein the titular giant, through amnesia, comes to reject his nature as a weapon and actually uses his powers to protect a small town in Cold War America from an incoming atomic bomb. Yokoyama would later pen another manga, Giant Robo, with a very similar premise, though GR was invented by villains and was voice-controlled, only responding to the first voice whom it heard when activated. And fortunately, a boy by the name of Daisaku Kusama would be that first voice rather than the terrorist organization Big Fire. Yokoyama was a young boy during World War II, and the sight of his hometown's destruction when he returned from evacuation shook him to his core. He cites the aforementioned B-29s as one of his inspirations for Tetsujin, and the other was the 1931 Frankenstein film starring Boris Karloff. The notion of an artificial life, a man-shaped creation that is hated and feared and loathed despite being mostly innocent, was very compelling to Yokoyama. Personally speaking, Mary Shelley's novel is probably my favorite real, actual, no comic panels included book of all time. The bit that always sticks out in my mind is when Victor Frankenstein confronts his monster, who at that point has taken to personal vendettas against his creator, and when asked why the monster is so dedicated to tormenting the doctor, the monster replies, "I am malicious because I am miserable." The monster is hated and reviled by the doctor and by everyone he encounters before he even does anything evil, and so it lashes out. Yokoyama posits that perhaps a monster can be taught righteousness instead. The thought of Japan having its own nuclear arsenal is terrifying, but you can kinda see the appeal of the power fantasy from their point of view, right? What if we had our own superweapon? Maybe we would not be made to suffer so. You can draw parallels between this fantasy and the one of the American superhero. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were both the children of Jewish immigrants who fled anti-Semitism in their home countries for North America, and the two started creating comics together in the 1930s, when many Americans were very sympathetic to the Nazi Party. See my Guy King video for more on that. The mostly forgotten original Superman that Siegel created was a vindictive menace, but obviously his and Schuster's more popular creation was a champion for the weak and the downtrodden, and a foil to the Axis forces at home in the States. Some of Superman's earliest adventures involved fighting slumlords, corrupt police, and even the Klan. Again, from the perspective of a disempowered people, the desire for a powerful figure defending a vulnerable and frightened demographic, even though capable of quite intimidating force, is a sympathetic mindset. People might even project onto a superhero some kind of patriotic pride. Superman's motto was originally, "Fighting for truth and justice." But with other heroes of the era sporting very direct and intentional references to America, like Wonder Woman or The Shield or Liberty Bell or, of course, Captain America, it was expanded to truth, justice, and the American way during the course of the Cold War, when the nation was trying very hard to emphasize American exceptionalism and patriotic fervor. Though, like with Frankenstein's monster, the darkness of the human heart can give an otherwise benign fantasy the potential to be far less benign. With this machine, you can be like a god, or a devil. We can see this with Mazinger. Personal anecdote, my first time seeing Mazzy was among my older cousin's toys when I was a kid. He had one of those jumbo Machinder Shogun Warrior Great Mazinger toys, and if you've never played with one of those, they're rad as fuck. Missiles everywhere, roller feet, the removable brain condor from the head, and removable rocket fist. It was a really neat toy, even playing with it 30 years after its manufacturing. But having never seen or heard of this figure before, just from looking at it, I assumed it was an evil robot. The Mazines, which is an in-universe term for Mazinger, Great, Grendizer, and the others, have very intimidating, sinister faces. They're very imposing. Even without the extra pointy features of Great, regular Mazinger seems like he's wearing a crown atop his darkened visage, and his pointy red wings and breastplates on top of the dark color scheme make him very villain-coded. The spikes coming out of his neck and the way the hover piloter loads into the head like a brain also seem like a clear homage to Frankenstein once again. And while it's spelled Mazinger, it's deliberately trying to sound like Mashinga. While the word also sounds very similar to machine, Mazines are evil spirits, or dark gods, or demon lords. Though you probably remember that fact from Majin Buu and Majin Vegeta. Later super robots would definitely trend a lot closer to visually heroic, but sinister-looking heroes with great potential for harm is a recurring motif in Nagai's work. Not just in Mazinger, but in Devilman and Demon Lord Dante and Violence Jack and Jushin Liger. Even the good Professor Juzo is notably ugly in most incarnations aside from the original anime adaptation. Hey wait, he kinda looks like Einstein too! It's probably this fear of the misuse of his weapon, not unlike how Einstein feared the Nazis harnessing nuclear power, that causes Professor Juzo to entrust Koji with piloting Mazinger, and likewise Sayaka with piloting Aphrodite, rather than, say, a soldier or other adult. The thinking is probably that young people are not yet embittered by the world, not yet callous and cynical, and that's why the shaping of the future is best left to the likes of Shotaro or Daisaku or Koji. It's their world that they're going to inherit. It's their destiny to build tomorrow. They should have the agency to accomplish this. And it only makes sense that super technology be used to do this. Mazinger is powered by photon energy, which can be shot from its eyes as a beam weapon. I doubt that's exactly how photons work in real life, but the intended parallel is to nuclear energy, which in real life is cleaner and more renewable than fossil fuels. This theme of the next generation having to correct the mistakes of the previous generation is made even more explicit in Shin Mazinger Edition Z The Impact, where there's an increased focus on Koji's parents, as well as the Greek god Zeus, who in the myths is famous for having killed his father Kronos. The Z in Mazinger Z is in reference to the fictional Chogokin Z, or Super Alloy Z, which Mazinger is constructed from, and which makes it nigh invincible. Super Alloy Z is refined from the fictional element Japanium, so named because it can only be found in the sediment at the base of Mount Fuji. Like with the superheroes, this is a form of national exceptionalism. the notion that something about your country makes it better, makes it powerful in a unique way. The message being that Japan's prosperity will be found in nurturing the next generation, in educating them, and in them pioneering new sciences and new industries. Man, I'm hitting all the callbacks in this video. I talked about this in my Gunbuster video. And with Japan's reputation for manufacturing, engineering, and software, this message would appear to have been prophetic. This merger of youth and technology, of futuristic machinery cast in human form, was exemplified in Japanese pop culture even before Tetsujin, in the form of Osamu Tezuka's 1952 manga, Tetsuwan Otamu, or Mighty Atom, though we here in the States know him best as Astro Boy. Osamu Tezuka could probably be a whole video unto himself. The man was even more prolific than Nagai in his 60 years of life, and possibly more accomplished too, if you can even believe. I talked a bit about Astro in my High Gog video, but Astro Boy's 1963 anime, that Tezuka directed himself and produced via the studio he himself founded, Mushi Productions, seriously, Tezuka did so much awesome stuff in his life, was the first major TV anime hit of all time, and I should note that Astro, Tetsujin, and Giant Robo all had tokusatsu adaptations years before they had anime series. Astro's creation in the story was the result of Dr. Umataro Tenma suffering personal tragedy in the untimely death of his son Tobio, and him crafting a robot in his image as a coping mechanism. But when the robot can't live up to Dr. Tenma's expectations as a replacement son, he becomes furious and sells him off to a cruel circus ringmaster named Hamegg. It's only through Astro being discovered by the kindly Professor Ochanomizu, who recognizes Astro's potential as more than a sideshow attraction, that Astro gets the opportunity to be a powerful force for humanitarian efforts and social justice. Robots in Astro Boy's world are an exploited proletarian class that often get treated similarly to an oppressed racial minority. Astro, like Shotaro and Daisaku, tends to be very respectful of authority, in accordance with the laws of robotics that forbid the harm of humans, but he's also not above scolding or arguing with people who are decidedly harsh or hateful. Manners and respect are very, very important in Japanese culture. The stereotype of the bowing, stoic, polite Japanese person is not too far from the mark. Japanese citizens are expected to maintain composure and be overly formal, particularly with elders or people in positions of authority. But Koji's actually something of a brash, boisterous, fiery, in-your-face punk ass, not really typical of anime and manga characters at the time. And likewise, so are his friends, Boss, Nuke, and Mucha. Even Sayaka, who's usually the most mature among them, can't help but be loud and rowdy and tomboyish. In the wake of the war, many children were left orphaned and juvenile delinquency was on the rise for a time. A similar problem occurred here in the States and was part of the reason that Congress took a keen interest in censoring comic books. Long story, not the point. Anyways, this gave rise to the banchos and sukabans, or delinquent boys and delinquent girls, though the trend of delinquency waned come the 70s and 80s. But while real-life delinquency declined, stories about such characters gradually rose in popularity. The Bosozoku, or reckless biker gangs, actually grew steadily more popular from this point in time. Koji rides a motorcycle, and originally the plan was for that to run up a ramp on his robot's back to become the cockpit. But fearing being considered derivative of Kamen Rider, Nagai switched it to the hover pilder. Apparently he didn't mind the motorcycle motif that much because Tetsuya rides one, as does Devilman's Akira Fudo and Steel Jeeg's Hiroshi Shiba. Some more stereotypical representations of banchos and sukabans include Jotaro Kujo, Josuke Higashikata, Yusuke Urameshi, Great Teacher Onizuka, the characters from Tokyo Revengers, Ryuko Matoi, Saki Asamiya from Sukaban Deka, and Zombieland Saga's own Saki Nikaido. While the trope of more traditional bancho and sukaban characters has become gradually less popular, the spirit of them hasn't left in the least. It's a pretty common observation to point out the trend of anime and manga to take place in high school, but us in America, where our culture is more casual and socially relaxed, don't really notice how so many of those high schoolers are young upstarts and troublemakers. Naruto and Luffy and Asta and Denji and Ichigo and Yuji and MASH, they're all obnoxious and outspoken and rough around the edges. Even more traditionally well-mannered characters like Tanjiro or Broccoli Boy Deku have at least one side character like an Inosuke or a Bakugo. Looking at other Nagai works, Akira Fudo is actually quite mild-mannered until he acquires his Devilman powers specifically for the sake of fighting evil, whereupon he embraces a more mischievous and defiant disposition. These young heroes are often not very conventionally intelligent either, showing a complete disregard for their studies. The expectation is that students get a good education to prepare them to enter the workforce and be a productive member of society. But so many of these characters tend to reject traditional academics and further reject the brutal capitalist Japanese work culture that adulthood has in store. But it's not because they're stupid per se, they're just differently intelligent. They have aptitudes in things that the system doesn't value because it doesn't enrich some shareholder or Zaibatsu executive. Koji actually grows up to be a scientist like his father and grandfather before him, which is surprising. Again, not to say Koji's stupid, but he does seem to miss a lot of school piloting Mazinger, and it just seems pretty incongruous with his characterization. It's like learning that Wolverine is actually really passionate about knitting or something. Hell, Boss and his gang are frequently portrayed as oafish buffoons and screw-ups and troublemakers for the sake of comedy, but they still manage to build their own robot, the Boss Bowrot, out of scrap materials. And despite it being a rickety, clumsy, barely functional mess, they manage to get in the fray and help out, though usually in unintentional, foolhardy ways for the sake of some slapstick yucks. Man, imagine what they could accomplish if they were supplied with some decent equipment. Not everyone has a super scientist granddad with access to invincible metal like Koji. Don't count these guys out just because they're less generically anime handsome than the main character. A lot of these protagonists also have blonde or light-colored hair as a deliberate stylistic character choice. Anime hair colors have been subject to scrutiny before, and while pink or purple or blue or green are likely done for the sake of merchandising waifus, some of the colors are deliberately meant to evoke real-world hair dye. Bleaching one's hair is a common act of rebellion among Japanese youth, where the expectation is that they'll conform to the cultural hegemony. Where us in the West might go for a purple mohawk as a means of pissing off our conservative parents, something as simple as blonde highlights or a total hair bleaching is enough for a Japanese high schooler. Hence why Nagai so frequently gravitated to these unconventional hero archetypes. It is again a challenge to the status quo. It's championing the cause of youthful rebellion over the stuffy conservatism of the older generations whom have put the world in this regrettable state where the hero characters need to fight for a better world. The supposed order of the world is not serving the people who live here, so it's up to the next generation to be subversive and anti-authoritarian and defiant and tell all the adults what stupid assholes they are. The intention in these stories is to instill in the young audiences a desire to make a world less rigid, less conformist, less cruel, and less exploitative. And doing that will probably entail pissing off the adults. So if you were an uninformed dipshit, you might say something like, "Oh, unlike other mecha anime, Mazinger Z is about the characters more than the robots." And it's worth repeating, it's not just the boys who demonstrate this agency. Sayaka's an active participant. Aphrodite A is substantially less powerful, and this results in her ending up as Koji's April O'Neil not too infrequently. But just like Boss, she still straps on her helmet and dutifully goes out to help no matter the peril, because her contributions might be just what Koji needs to get out of a jam. And while it'd be easy to write this off as some kind of boorish chauvinism on behalf of Nagai, the fact that she's getting out there at all is in stark defiance of gender expectations in Japan. Women are expected to be even more docile and demure and deferential than men. They're expected to be domestic and subservient. But they undoubtedly would have been essential to bolstering the Japanese workforce during and after the war. Sayaka and June and other mecha maidens such as Mitsuru Satome, Sho Tachibana, Miwa Uzuki, Hikaru Makiba, Maria Grace Freed, they all join the fray, and they're not just sidekicks and love interests. Devilman has an intense rivalry with Demon Bird Serene. The main antagonist of Jeeg is Queen Himika. Hell, Nagai even wrote plenty of solo female heroes too. Cutie Honey is a whole-ass superhero, not a sidekick. Her powers allow her to change outfits to suit her situation, whether that be for the sake of going undercover or going into battle. And while that essentially gives her the same powers as a Barbie doll, and part of the point of that is so that her silhouette can be briefly naked during the transformation sequence, it's also a strong message to the little girls that would have been watching that they can be career women. They don't just have to be wives and mothers, they can be the main characters of their own story. Action-oriented power babes are a proud staple of anime, and not just in the form of harem sidekicks and indulgent isekai. The Sailor Scouts, the Dirty Pair, Lena Inverse, Birdie the Mighty, Utena Tenjo, Major Kusanagi, Jolene Kujo, Eiko Megami, Emeraldus, Claire from Claymore, Ghost Sweeper Mikami, Ryoko Matoi, Rally Vincent, Battle Angel Alito, the Night Sabers from Bubblegum Crisis, Bayonetta, Samus Aran, Saya from Blood Plus, Yomiko from Read or Die, the girls from Licorice Recoil, and that's to say nothing of the badass Bettys who aren't the main characters in the story, but still kick plenty of ass too, sometimes even more so than some of the dudes. There's plenty of Chun-Li's, Urza Scarlet's, Jun the Swan's, Beatrix Ammerhauser's, Yor Forgers, and Maki Zenins to go around. Though it could be pointed out that most women in anime tend to fall prey to some somewhat unfortunate fan-servicey objectification. That the strong ladies don't exist for their own sake, or for the sake of appealing to female audiences, but for the sake of the objectifying male gaze. And admittedly, some of the blame for that could be put on the shoulders of Nagai and his works like Mazinger, Devilman, and Cutie Honey, and particularly things like Kekko Kamen and his breakout hit Harenchi Gakuen. While the idea of anime that you watch for the quote-unquote plot is extremely commonplace now, it wasn't so in the 1960s. More conservative views on sexuality, in line with imported Western Christianity, had been adopted over time, from missionaries during the Sengoku period and again during the Meiji period. Japan has kind of a weird relationship with healthy sexual expressions as a result, and that polite, reserved nature and traditionalism tends to manifest in puritanical prudishness, at least as a means of presenting itself socially. If you've ever tried looking up Japanese porn or even uncensored hentai, it's a little tricky to find much of it. There's all kinds of vague, confusing, overly punitive laws and standards that usually result in censoring at least a couple of the fun parts that you were hoping to see when you search for, pornography. And yet we've seen how openly horny many of their cultural exports can be. Harenchi Gakuen became popular in its day for embracing a lot more sophomoric antics and open eroticism. Now, by modern standards, where we've been exposed to the likes of High School of the Dead, Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, Rent a Girlfriend, and Shimonetta, all airing on Japanese television, Harenchi Gakuen's honestly nothing too shocking. But it put a bee in the bonnet of many parents' groups at the time. But Nagai was careful to not include actual sex scenes, he avoided pictures of genitals, and he framed nudes in ways that were less risque. Now, fair's fair, Nagai was 23 when he started work on Gakuen, and his cast and target audience consisted of primarily high schoolers, so yeah, kind of not great from that standpoint. I mentioned this in my Gunbuster video, and I still want to circle back to it in future videos, but this trend of adults making horny stories about children for children is something that anime desperately needs to re-examine, and troublesome portrayals of sexuality are present in works like Seven Deadly Sins, My Hero Academia, Made in Abyss, Rising of the Shield Hero, and frankly, so many others. However, I think it's worth noting that conservatism tends to be repressive of all manners of sexuality, regardless of how healthy. I mean, fuck, we even have Andrew Tate, the man who used to sell himself as a master of picking up women, now saying that sex should be strictly for procreation and that any recreational sex is deviant, actually. So hypothetically, if these outraged parents had caught their kids with copies of, say, Golden Boy, which is a seinen manga with a primarily adult cast of similarly raunchy nature that ran in the 90s, they would still throw fits even though that manga isn't for children, just like American parents groups do over Penthouse or Pornhub. The ending chapters of Gakuen actually feature outraged PTA groups who indiscriminately murder all the students and teachers of the school in needlessly brutal ways for their freedom of expression. "Won't someone think of the children?" is often used as a cudgel against everything from actual pornography made by consenting adults, to R-rated movies, intense rock and rap music, mature-rated violent video games, Dungeons & Dragons, Wonder Woman's superhero costume, and any mention of LGBT themes at all. Speaking of, queer themes have light appearances in the guy's work as well. Baron Ashura, as previously mentioned, is the result of stitching together a bisected man and woman, meaning Ashura is intersex and sometimes uses they-them pronouns. And it's also sometimes lightly hinted that they love Dr. Hell. Meanwhile, Devilman's Rio Asuka, whom is eventually revealed to be Satan, is in love with his friend Akira, aka Devilman, and he deliberately takes steps to preserve Akira's life, though his villainous actions lead Akira to despise him. Perhaps, if he'd felt confident enough to express this to Akira earlier, he might not have done all the heinous things he did later in the series. And instances of queerness are present in Cutie Honey, Kekko Kamen, Violence Jack, Oira Sukaban, and others. And it's not even just a case of a straight man like Nagai being kind of juvenile either. Osamu Tezuka's 1967 samurai manga Dororo features a canonically trans man as the title character, as does the 1972 manga The Rose of Versailles. Here's another little personal testimony. Back in high school during the aughts, I remember a lot of people who were into anime at the time kind of discovering themselves as queer via anime or using it to explore their identities, and it wasn't hard to see why. Whether it was Ranma 1/2 or Fruits Basket or Utena or Sailor Moon or Death Note or Fred from Outlaw Star or Koyuki and Private Tamama from Sergeant Frog or Naruto and Sasuke accidentally kissing each other, or the manga Iri Query, a lot of people identified with queer representation that our American media was still pretty gun-shy about at the time. At time of writing, Fox News has just recently discovered that the character Vivian in Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door is canonically trans, a fact that was omitted from the original US release for GameCube, but restored in the recent Switch release. And of course, they're throwing a fit about it. I'm gonna go ahead and guess that they're also unaware of who Birdo and Bowsette are. Weird regional rules regarding censorship play a lot into things like this happening, but queer people have a pretty strong presence in Japanese media, and not because they're trying to pander to US audiences. I mean, Sailor Moon bent over backwards to insist that their lesbian couple were actually just cousins in the US broadcast, and the Saban version of Tekkaman Blade, renamed Technoman for UPN kids, took the highly flamboyant and effeminate gay character Levin and just made them a woman named Maggie. And that's just on the US side. In Japan, there's actually pretty strict rules about depicting male-on-male relationships in film or television. It has to either be subtextual with a decent amount of room for deniability, or it has to be portrayed comically. It's probably why Yuri on Ice got stalled out, and why Kawaru and Shinji didn't get to be endgame lovers in Eva Rebuild, and he instead had to end up with Mari. Lesbianism, however, is allowed to be handled differently, and I'll let you guess for yourself why that might be. Now, here recently, the series Bang Brave Bang Bravern, about a giant robot who is pretty openly gay for his male pilot, has been a pretty big hit, and between that, Fromare, Robihachi, SSSS Gridman, and Witch from Mercury, I found myself musing that recent Mecha series were really embracing queer identity. But upon reflection, there's been queerness, coded or otherwise, in a lot of Mecha series, from many Gundam entries to many of the works by Masami Obari, to Liron from Gurren Lagann, to Project Echo, Rini no Lagrange, Aquarion, Zegapane, Knights of Sidonia, Crossange, Godiner, Fight Ixer 1, Bandred, Diebuster, Legend of the Blue Wolves. I don't know, maybe the gay is just coming from within Japan, guys. Certainly don't look too deeply into samurai if you don't want to believe that. Now, I mentioned in my Evangelion video that single-pilot mechs could be seen as a metaphor for Japanese isolationism, and Mazinger's nickname as Kurogane no Shiro, the Fortress of Steel, could definitely support that. What is a fortress after all, if not a means to keep out invaders? No one builds a fortress lest there is something they feel the need to protect and isolate from. It's meant as a stronghold to be the vanguard that protects a territory. And should the fortress fall, so too would the land that it seeks to protect. But thinking specifically of Mazinger, I don't know if this totally holds up on reflection. Koji's connections to his friends and loved ones are important, and while he's alone within Mazinger, he's not alone on the battlefield. Boss and Sayaka are there with him in their own individual mechs. Getter Robo and the various combiner mechs that would follow after, such as Combattler V and Voltron, would also emphasize the importance of teamwork as a means of accomplishing their victories. And if it was meant as a metaphor for keeping out foreigners, that falls on its face too with Great Mazinger's Jun Hono, who again is half Japanese, half black. As a child, she was bullied for her skin color by her full-blooded Japanese peers, and she would even try to scrub her skin off with steel wool. But she finds love and acceptance from Tetsuya, and the two later have children together. If that's not enough, Boss seems to have a pretty big crush on her too. And over in Getter Robo, we have Texas Mac, a cowboy robot piloted by American siblings Jack and Mary King, who become trusted allies of the Getter team. You would think if Japan had beef with any nation, it would be America, for pretty decent reasons. But still, the message to Japanese schoolchildren remains consistent. Unity despite our differences. Meanwhile, over in Dezuka's 1950 manga, Jungle Emperor, known here in the States as Kimba the White Lion, or that one anime that did The Lion King before Disney did, much of the conflict of the series stems from the animals and the humans being unable to communicate with each other, and the hero, Kimba, known as Leo in Japanese, trying his best to navigate how best to reconcile the differences between the two groups so that they can coexist. Dezuka himself had a run-in with a drunk American GI that went poorly due to the language barrier, and while he could have easily written Americans off as enemies, he, like so many of his peers and seemingly like Nagai, understood that our similarities outweigh our differences, and that wars arise from focusing on what divides us rather than unites us. This was also the premise of my Guy King video, how the Zellans and the humans would have benefited from coming together, and that series ends with the Zellans overthrowing their evil rulers because they actually don't want to make war with the humans. Something I neglected to mention in that video was how that was one of the earliest mecha shows to feature the characters visiting real-world locations outside of Japan. Here in 2024, the latest entry in the Assassin's Creed series, a video game developed by French company Ubisoft, has sparked controversy by centering the game in Japan's Sengoku period, but not around a native Japanese person, but rather of the real-world figure Yasuke, a black man who was a samurai under Oda Nobunaga. And yes, he was a samurai, retainers were samurai. But of course, all the biggest pants-shitting weirdos on the internet have been crying about forced diversity and agendas and woke mind virus and such. I guess, does that make Jun Hono the product of a woke agenda? What about Lala from Gundam? Or Claudia from Macross? Or Avdol and Smokey from JoJo? They all existed prior to anime being imported to the States in a meaningful fashion. Was that pandering? To whom? What about Casca from Berserk or Yoriuchi from Bleach? Kabru from Dungeon Meshi, Canary from Hunter x Hunter, Nils Nielsen from Gundam Build, Barrett from Final Fantasy VII, Lord Killer Bee, Usopp, Afro Samurai, Father Pucci. Help me out here, which of these are pandering? I need to know what I'm supposed to be mad at. Was it tokenism when Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo as thematic motifs both heavily featured the music and aesthetics of hip-hop and jazz, which are both creations of black culture? When did wokeism start again? I forget. Was it Gamergate or was it the Lady Ghostbusters? No, I got it. It was Brie Larson, right? That was patient zero for the woke mind virus. Or maybe, and hear me out here, maybe Japanese creators just feel like including black people? Maybe, possibly? Do you remember earlier how I said that some people in Japan dye their hair to be rebellious? Well, they tan their skin at tanning salons too in order to appear more Western and less traditionally Japanese. Pale skin, dark hair, quiet, reserved, stoic, and respectful. That's what's expected out of good Japanese citizens. And yet there are people there who reject this arbitrary standard of beauty and embrace alternatives. Hell, the Ganguro or Genki girl fashion trend, where women bleach their hair, tan their skin, and wear loads of makeup, was actually a feminist movement meant to reject rigid beauty standards that appeal to traditionally minded men. The kawaii culture of grown women acting extra cutesy and infantile was also at one point meant to reject tradwife domesticity. The Bozozoku biker gangs are a rejection of brutal work culture with slavishly long hours, and similarly, so too is the otaku subculture, a rejection of those same crushing, inhuman responsibilities that Japanese adulthood heaps on their workforce. Do you remember me saying that despite the perception, Japan isn't ethnically unified? There's also the Ainu people. Well, the Ainu aren't the only indigenous ethnicity. There's also the Hayato, the Ryukyuan, and the Amishi peoples, all living there, though subject to the brutal assimilation and erasure of their culture. And these ethnicities make appearances in titles such as Princess Mononoke, Shaman King, Golden Kamui, and Samurai Champloo. The supposed unified monoculture of Japan is anything but. It's certainly less racially diverse than North America, but there are very different historical factors at play here. Hey, I made some remarks in my Gunbuster video regarding Mr. Popo and how he's an example of ugly racial stereotypes. Well, you could certainly draw similarities to him and jinn or genies from Arabic and Islamic folklore, or to Indian yogis, kind of like Dulcim from Street Fighter. But something I didn't know was that he also bears a striking resemblance to Mahakala, a Hindu and Buddhist deity, and that this might have been part of Mr. Popo's inspiration rather than a racial stereotype. Something that I did know and that I failed to mention in that video was that a lot of Japan's exposure to black people in the years following World War II would have likely been through media shared with them from, you guessed it, Americans. And while America is again more racially diverse, we weren't always the best at depicting people of color in early Hollywood. A lot of those early film and television portrayals were exaggerated performances portrayed by white people wearing blackface. So, if anything, much of their racial stereotyping would have been learned from watching us. Guess we're to blame for Viscount Pigment. One could make the argument that Japanese media has a lot of room to improve in regards to its progressive messaging, and I agree with that. There could be way more kick-ass lady characters in leading roles. They could design their ethnically diverse characters in more sensitive fashions, and definitely include a lot more of them. And they could do way fucking better about how they do fan service in a way that's not so questionable. But that's true of even American media. Every country is at different stages in their social and civil progress, and all of them could be doing better in some respects, but all of them have their own progressive movements rejecting their own oppressive institutions. Here lately, with Western culture warriors finding new things to bitch about in regards to American cinema, television, comic books, and video games, a lot of these grimy little trolls have been holding up Japan and its culture as some kind of anti-woke haven filled with media that supports their traditional values and status quo worldview. They view Japan as a hegemonic conservative paradise. But it's not that. It never was. And if they really knew Japanese pop culture as well as they fancy they did, they would know that. Or maybe they're being deliberately dishonest about that and choosing to focus on the instances that align with their shitty worldviews. Maybe by accusing progressive fans of cultural erasure, they are themselves erasing the culture that they're talking about. Are there Japanese people who align with those beliefs and manifest them in their works? Sure, but there's people like that everywhere. Alt-right American Islamophobes and radical West-hating Islamic fundamentalists regard each other as savages, but they'll still jump into the same internet forums and agree with each other about how much they hate women and gays. Neo-Nazis and anti-white black separatists both clean their guns thinking about the opportunity to use them on each other, but they'll both laugh at the same anti-Semitic jokes. And Japanese ultra-conservatives who agree with American ethno-nationalists about authoritarian policies will hate the fact that their domestic media is being exported to us bastard gaijin, no matter if there's pronouns in the bio of those Western fans or not. And what's annoying is that even a lot of more progressive-minded weebs will kind of shake their heads and concede that maybe anime is a little too regressive and that maybe these dickheads have a point and that a lot of this stuff isn't worth defending. But I hope I've illustrated that no, that's not the case. Anime, manga, and tokusatsu are, at their core, from their inception, from some of their most influential series, more subversive, more progressive, more left-leaning than we often give them credit for being. Do not concede any ground to the worst goddamn people on the internet. Certainly not all series are progressive. Japan isn't a monolith, as I said. You can certainly find series that feature reactionary messaging, like Angel Cop, or Goblin Slayer, or Love Hina, or whatever. But do not just shrug and let the shittiest losers dictate this conversation. Hateful people don't get to claim cool media, even if it's problematic in some ways. Do not empower them by letting them think that they're the same as Goku, or Guts, or Batman, or Marcus Phoenix, because those characters are strong and competent. And by their nature, reactionaries are not. So don't let them dominate the conversation on anime. Anime's too big and too important to too many people to just cede to them. The super robot genre is just kind of a microcosm of a lot of this forward-thinking mentality with all its diverse, impactful, and profoundly human offerings, stretching back decades before we had Toonami, Crunchyroll, 4Kids, and Manga UK. And it's tied to so many other genres in its influences and its impact. And there's a reason anime and manga are having such universal appeal all across the world today. It's because there's a lot of talented, smart, insightful people using their unique culture and circumstances to tap into something that resonates with so many of us. And that's cool. It's why I like sharing it with you guys, sharing the stuff that you won't get from Mother's Basement or Super Eye Patch Wolf or whoever. And I hope you got a little something out of this video, and all of my videos. Some little spark of why I think this topic is so fascinating. It's a futuristic vision of hope and progress, dreamed up by a people who faced down a pretty profoundly disturbing human catastrophe, and came out the other side more thoughtful and more determined. And I can't help but admire that. Well, that and the nifty toys. There's another one in the book, Spot Buds. Hope it was as good for you as it was for me. And if it were, why don't you rocket punch the like button for me? Hell, if you really liked it, maybe you'll consider firing your beam rifle at the subscribe button. Maybe you might even pull out your blazing sword and slash the notifications bell so you can hear about my videos as soon as they drop. And if you really, really, really liked it, maybe share it with someone who you think might also appreciate it, and then they can combine with my giant robot viewer base to form a bigger robot. But if by some chance you didn't like it, impossible as that might seem, I suppose you could also transform and roll out in the comments and let me know what a moron I am. Maybe you just feel so bad about me being such a painfully stupid dipshit, you decide you need to donate some money at my Ko-fi link down below so that I can get the professional help I so desperately need. Whew! I tell you, really digging deep on Mazzy here was a lot of fun. I wonder if there was any other deeply influential mecha anime that I might try really putting under a microscope. Something with a little more grit and wit to really sink my teeth into now that the whole real-world history lesson has been told. Guess I'll think on it a little. In the meantime, ChatBots mission complete. This is DBiddles, signing off. Sayonara, bye-bye.